Welcome back to another music lesson. My name is Miss Katelyn, and today we're going to learn about another group of instruments. Can anyone remember what the name of the family of instruments that we learned last week was? Here's a hint. It included the violin, the viola, the cello, the double bass, and the harp. If you thought the string family, you were right. Today, we're going to learn about another family of instruments. Today, our instruments are called the Woodwind family. The Woodwind family also has 5 instruments that we're going to talk about today. Those 5 instruments are the flute, the oboe, the clarinet, the bassoon, and the saxophone. Just like all our string instruments were in one family because they all had strings, even though some of them used a bow and some of them didn't, all of our woodwind instruments are in the woodwind family because you have to blow into them for them to make a sound. 4 of the instruments, the oboe, the clarinet, the bassoon, and the saxophone use something called a reed, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit. The flute is different. You still have to blow into it, but you get sound by blowing across it, and it's different, which is why we're actually going to start with the flute today. So, our flute is long, and does it look like it's made of wood like our strings? No, our flute is made out of metal. Most commonly, flutes are made out of silver, but there can be other metals as well that we'll talk about. And guess what, friends? Out of all the instruments, Miss Katelyn plays 2 of them, and the flute is 1, which means that next week we're going to do a special feature just about the flute. So everything we're going to talk about today is just a little sneak peek of next week. So our flutes are silver, and if you look at the top, you have a lip plate, this round part here, and this hole called your embouchure hole. It's a big word. You say embouchure. That is where you place your lips. So this part of the flute rests underneath your lips, like if you put your finger here, and if you pretended you were blowing out 100 birthday candles, you notice that some of the air is going down and some of it is going directly across. This is how the flute makes the sound, because as it's running across the air, it's also running through the tube and out the keys, which makes it make a sound. A flute sits underneath your lip and comes out to your right side. I know the camera's in reverse right now, but this is my right hand. It's going out your right side, and your right hand goes this way, and your left hand comes this way. So our flute is a pretty high instrument. So we have a video of what the flute sounds like, and this is actually a gold flute, which is really special. So you see he's holding it. This is the right side of his body, but the camera is still in reverse. He's blowing across the flute, and it's making a sound. So he's pretty high notes. His fingers are moving pretty quickly. But as it continues, he's going to get a little bit lower here. And behind him, all of our videos today have some piano or other instruments in them. So this is one of like the middle to lower notes that the flute can play. There's a lower note. Listen just another couple minutes here. So friends, the flute is my favorite instrument because it's one of the ones that I play. So we'll talk about it more next week. Okay, so do you remember how I told you the 4 other woodwind instruments today? The oboe, the clarinet, the bassoon, and the saxophone are all very similar because unlike the flute, they use something called a reed. 2 of the instruments, which we're going to talk about first, the clarinet and the saxophone, only have 1 reed. This is what this looks like. In my picture over here, do you see this is a reed? And what this is a little piece of material that sits behind the mouthpiece. So where a clarinet and a saxophone you blow on. The saxophone's is the black part right there. And the clarinet sits up here. And the reed helps the air to vibrate and it creates the sound. So we're gonna do our clarinet first because it's higher than the saxophone. Our clarinet is sometimes made out of wood or plastic or other materials, and has metal keys. And just like the flute, it has hands that reach to the middle so you can play with all of your fingers. But unlike the flute, which goes sideways, your clarinet plays down low and in front of you, and it can play a little lower than the flute can, and not quite as high, but it gets pretty close. So, my friends, we are going to listen to what the clarinet sounds like. So that's a lower note than the flute can play. So he's playing out in front of him, and he's blowing into the reed with his lips, and it's making the sound, coming all the way down the clarinet and out the bottom, which is really cool. Turn down the brightness just a little bit. There we go. So that's pretty cool, huh? That is our clarinet. Our other instrument with one reed is the saxophone. The saxophone looks a lot different from our clarinet. You still blow into the mouthpiece, but the sound travels down and out this end right here. You also use two hands with one on each side, and it sits in front of you, so you're still blowing down like you do with the clarinet. But our saxophone can be made with other different metals, and it's gonna sound different, typically lower than a clarinet plays, but it can still play high notes. So let me find our saxophone. So here's, I told you how all our videos, a lot of them have piano in them today. Let's see, there he goes. So you can hear him playing out in front of him, and he has one hand on each side. So he's blowing into that one reed that we talked about on the mouthpiece, and it's coming down and out the bottom. See, there's a high note that the saxophone can play. So, very cool. Okay, some of our reeded instruments that we haven't talked about yet don't use one reed. They use two reeds. So our oboe and our bassoon are called double reeded instruments. And what that means, friends, is that rather than our clarinet and our saxophone, whose reed looks like this, an oboe and a bassoon have this. And what this means is, if you can see, there are two individual pieces, and they come together for this little tiny opening at the top. And the sound is the air traveling between the two reeds, which is gonna make them sound a little different. So this was our picture for bassoon and our bassoon and oboe reed versus our clarinet and saxophone reed, and what they'll look like. So if you see on our oboe, here's the reed at the very top. You'll notice that it's black like our clarinet is. This is our clarinet and our oboe, but the oboe, the bottom's a little more narrow, and they're mostly different because the clarinet has one reed and the oboe has two. So our oboe, like our clarinet though, is placed in front of you, and you still have a hand that goes on both sides. It's our higher instrument than the bassoon, so we're gonna play with our oboe first. I'm gonna find a good starting point for us. So you can see how it sounds very different from how the clarinet sounds. He's out in front, so you can't see it very well. I'll zoom in. See how he's playing it in front of him? And his lips are like this, so that he can hold the reed in front of it and blow them. So it's higher, and it sounds a little different. It sometimes can sound like a duck a little bit. Can you think of any other animals you think that it sounds like? So that's our oboe. And our very last instrument today that we're gonna talk about, friends, also has two reeds like the oboe does, but it's lower. This, my friends, is the biggest instrument we talk about today. This is the bassoon. Here at the end is that reed that we talked about that attaches to this little curve called the bocal, and it's really long and typically made of wood, and it plays a lot lower. If you've ever seen the movie Fantasia, the bassoons are going to play for us some of the Sorcerer's Apprentice. And this is a group of, you can see 4 of them sitting here, just one of them. So it's nice and low. Skip ahead just a little bit. So see how they sit down with their bassoons? And it comes out the side. And the top is where the sound is coming out, but they're holding it sideways. So they're blowing straight in front of them. It's still a little bright. And you can hear how it sort of sounds like the oboe, but it's a lot lower than our oboe because, friends, it's a lot bigger, which is how our instruments usually work. Remember how we talked about a long time ago how really big instruments make really low sounds, really high instruments make really high, or really small instruments make really high sounds. So it helps our instruments all sound different. So our woodwind instruments sound very different from each other, right? So let's review what all of them were. We talked about the flute, which you have to play sideways and blow across. We talked about the clarinet and the saxophone, which use 1 reed. The clarinet, which is higher than the saxophone. And then we talked about the oboe and the bassoon, where our oboe is higher than our bassoon, and they have a double reed. So they have 2 reeds that they blow between. And all our instruments, do you remember what the name of the family is called? The Woodwind Family. The Woodwind Family that you all blow in. So join me next week as we take a special sneak peek at the flute, and I'll show you my flute and play some for you, and it will be really, really cool. Okay, until then, bye friends.